1 American soldier, 3 German Tiger tanks, 75 yards of Italian farmland. On May 23, 1944, a single technical sergeant did what an entire battalion couldn't do. He shattered a fortified enemy line, stopped a mechanized counterattack with his bare hands, and changed the outcome of one of World War II's bloodiest campaigns. This is not legend. This is not Hollywood. This happened. And what Van Barfoot did in 11 hours of uninterrupted combat remains one of the most audacious displays of individual battlefield dominance ever recorded in modern warfare. The morning light came reluctantly to the Italian countryside that day, filtering through the smoke of artillery barrages that had pounded the earth since before dawn. Technical Sergeant Van Thomas Barfoot crouched in a shallow irrigation ditch southeast of Carano, his hands wrapped around a bazooka that felt simultaneously too heavy and too small for what he was about to attempt. Before him, emerging from the haze of cordite and dust like prehistoric beasts summoning themselves from the underworld, 3 German tanks rumbled forward across the torn fields. Their engines produced a mechanical thunder that he could feel in his chest, a vibration that seemed to pass through the soil itself and announce the futility of resistance. He had been awake for more than 20 hours. His uniform was caked with mud and darker stains he preferred not to examine. The bazooka, a weapon he had never fired in actual combat until this morning, rested against his shoulder with an awkward unfamiliarity. He knew the mathematics of the situation with perfect clarity. A bazooka round under ideal conditions might penetrate the side armor of a medium tank. These were not medium tanks. These were Tigers, the most formidable armored vehicles the German army possessed. Machines that had broken entire Allied formations, each one a 40-ton fortress of Krupp steel and concentrated violence. The frontal armor of a Tiger tank was designed to shrug off hits from dedicated anti-tank guns. A bazooka round against that plating would accomplish nothing more than announcing his position to the machine gunners inside. Yet here he was, alone in an exposed ditch, preparing to engage them anyway, because there was no one else. Because if he did not, the tanks would roll through the position his platoon had secured at such terrible cost earlier that morning, would crush the advance that had finally broken through German defenses that had held the Allies locked in the Anzio beachhead for 4 agonizing months. Everything they had accomplished, everything he had accomplished in the hours since first light, would collapse into meaningless sacrifice. The realization carried no drama, no swelling of orchestral courage. It was simply a fact, delivered to him by experience and observation, filed away in the same mental compartment where he stored knowledge about terrain features and effective grenade range. He would have to engage the tanks. The alternative was unacceptable. Therefore, the alternative did not exist. But to understand how Van Barfoot arrived at this impossible moment, one must return to the hours before dawn, when the plan that would define his life first took shape in his mind. The offensive was scheduled to begin at 0600 hours, but Barfoot had been awake since 0400, studying the ground they would have to cross in the pre-dawn darkness. He had volunteered for night reconnaissance patrols more than once in recent weeks, not from any particular appetite for danger but because he possessed an almost photographic memory for landscape. He could move through terrain once and retain a mental map of every depression, every cluster of rocks, every irrigation ditch that might provide cover or concealment. This gift, if it could be called that, had kept him alive through North Africa and Sicily, and he intended for it to keep him alive through whatever hell the Italian campaign had left to offer. The area southeast of Carano was agricultural land, or had been before the war converted it into a killing ground. Vineyards and wheat fields had been transformed into a checkerboard of interlocking defensive positions. Machine gun nests sited to create crossfire zones where advancing infantry would be caught in lethal geometric patterns of fire. The Germans had been fortifying these positions for weeks, perhaps months. They understood, as the Allies understood, that Carano represented a critical junction point. If it fell, the entire western anchor of the German defensive line would collapse. If it held, the Anzio beachhead would remain what it had been since January, a festering wound that consumed men and material without producing strategic advantage. Barfoot's company, Company L of the 157th Infantry Regiment, had been given the mission of taking Carano. It was the kind of mission that appeared straightforward on a map and became a nightmare the moment boots hit ground. The Germans had mined the approaches extensively. not with the random scattering of mines that characterized hasty defensive preparation, but with the methodical density that spoke of engineer units given time and resources. Barfoot had seen the telltale signs during his reconnaissance: disturbed earth in patterns too regular to be natural, fields where the grass grew differently because the soil had been excavated and replaced. The conventional approach would be to advance behind a rolling artillery barrage, hoping the bombardment would detonate enough mines to create safe corridors. But artillery was inexact and mines were cheap. The Germans could replace destroyed mines faster than the Allies could shell them. What was needed was not firepower but intelligence. Someone who could identify the pattern of mine placement, find the gaps, and create a route that bypassed the densest concentrations. At 0530 hours, Barfoot approached his platoon leader, 2nd Lieutenant Alton Westberg. The lieutenant was a good officer, competent and careful, which meant he understood the mission they had been given was likely to cost them half the platoon before they closed within 100 yards of the German positions. Barfoot's proposal was simple and insane in equal measure. He would go forward alone, move through the minefield using routes he had identified during night reconnaissance, neutralize whatever German positions he encountered, and create a lane through which the rest of the company could advance. Westberg's initial response was predictable. "That's suicide, Sergeant." "Sending the whole company across that field is suicide, sir," Barfoot replied. His voice carried the flat certainty of a man who had performed similar calculations before. "I can move through it. I've walked that ground. I know where the mines are thin." "You think you know?" "Yes, sir. I think I know." There was a long silence during which Westberg studied Barfoot's face, searching perhaps for signs of misplaced heroism or death wish. He would find neither. Barfoot was a professional soldier in the most literal sense, a man who approached warfare as a craft requiring skill, experience, and dispassionate judgment. He was not proposing to sacrifice himself. He was proposing to use specialized knowledge to solve a tactical problem. "If you get yourself killed, I'm putting it in the report that you went against orders," Westberg said finally. "Yes, sir." "How long do you need?" "Give me 20 minutes. If I'm not back, send the company anyway and hope for the best." Westberg checked his watch. 20 minutes. Starting now. Barfoot moved out immediately, carrying his Thompson submachine gun, a musette bag containing 4 fragmentation grenades, and the accumulated weight of every decision he had made since enlisting 3 years earlier. The pre-dawn darkness provided some concealment, but not much. The Germans had been shelling the area intermittently throughout the night, and the smoldering impacts provided enough illumination to reduce shadows to unreliable cover. He moved in short bursts, following routes he had memorized, staying low in the irrigation ditches that crisscrossed the fields. The first machine gun nest was positioned exactly where he expected it to be, on a slight rise overlooking the main approach route, its field of fire calculated to catch anyone attempting to advance through the obvious path of least resistance. The Germans were not stupid. They knew how soldiers thought, knew that men under fire would instinctively seek the easiest route, and they positioned their weapons accordingly. But Barfoot was not approaching through the easiest route. He was coming from the flank, using a drainage ditch that appeared too shallow to provide cover but was just deep enough for a man willing to crawl on his belly through mud and standing water. He could hear the machine gun crew talking, their voices low but carrying in the pre-dawn stillness. German voices, casual, discussing something that might have been food or women or the miserable conditions of garrison duty in Italy. They were not expecting contact. Why would they? The American attack was not scheduled to begin for another 15 minutes, and no sane man would be crawling through a minefield in the dark. Barfoot pulled a grenade from his bag, checked the pin with his fingertips, and waited. Timing was critical. If he attacked too early, the explosion would alert other German positions and compromise the entire plan. If he waited too long, the artillery barrage that would signal the beginning of the American assault would start, and he would lose the element of surprise. He counted seconds in his head, feeling the weight of the grenade in his palm, and then pulled the pin and threw. The explosion was flat and loud, the characteristic crack of a fragmentation grenade detonating against earth and sandbags. He did not wait to observe the results. He was already moving, Thompson up and ready, advancing toward the position while the Germans were still processing what had happened. 2 men emerged from the smoke, one of them screaming, and Barfoot shot them both with short, controlled bursts. A third man appeared with his hands raised, and Barfoot grabbed him by the collar and pulled him into the ditch. Minen? Barfoot asked, pointing to the ground ahead.
Wo sind die Minen?
The German soldier was young, perhaps 19. His face streaked with dirt and blood from a shrapnel cut across his forehead. He stared at Barfoot with the glazed incomprehension of a man whose world had just exploded, literally, and then pointed to the right, toward a section of field that looked identical to every other section of field. Dort, he said.
Überall dort.
Everywhere there. Helpful. Barfoot pushed the soldier toward the American lines and moved on. The second machine gun nest was 20 yards further, positioned to cover the approach from a different angle. Barfoot could see the muzzle of the MG-42 protruding from a sandbag position, could see the slight movement that indicated the crew was awake and alert. He circled wide, using the terrain, coming at them from their blind side. Another grenade, another explosion, another burst of Thompson fire into the smoke. 1 German dead, another wounded badly enough that he would not be a threat. Barfoot kept moving. The third nest was the most dangerous because by now the Germans knew something was happening. He could hear shouting, could hear the sharp crack of rifle fire as German soldiers tried to locate the source of the attacks. But they were looking in the wrong direction, expecting an assault from the front, from the obvious direction, and Barfoot was behind them now, inside their defensive perimeter, moving through spaces they had considered secure. This time he did not use a grenade. He came in fast and low, Thompson firing before the German crew could react. 2 men went down immediately. A third tried to swing the heavy machine gun around, but the weapon was mounted on a tripod for sustained fire, not close-quarters combat, and Barfoot shot him before he could bring it to bear. 2 more Germans emerged from a dugout behind the position, and one of them dropped his rifle and raised his hands. Barfoot gestured with his Thompson, and the 2 men moved toward the American lines with their hands on their heads. He had been moving for 17 minutes. 3 machine gun nests neutralized, for prisoners taken, and most importantly, a route through the minefield identified and marked in his memory. He ran back toward the American lines in a low crouch, moving fast now because speed was more important than stealth, and arrived at the jumping-off point with 90 seconds to spare before the artillery barrage began. Lieutenant Westberg looked at him as if he had returned from the dead.
Jesus Christ, Barfoot.
The left flank is clear, sir. Follow the irrigation ditch that runs along the vineyard, then cut right at the stone wall. Stay in the low ground and you'll miss most of the mines. Most of them. All the ones I saw. The artillery barrage began at exactly 0600 hours. A rolling thunder of high explosive and white phosphorus that turned the German positions into geysers of smoke and flame. Company L advanced behind it, moving fast, following the route Barfoot had cleared. The Germans, already disrupted by the loss of their forward machine gun positions, fell back in confusion. By 0800 hours, Company L had secured Carano, a village that had been a German strongpoint for 4 months, taken in a single swift assault because 1 man had been willing to walk through a minefield in the dark and do what an entire company could not. But the battle was not over. It was not even close to over. The Germans did not accept the loss of Carano with resignation. It was too important, too central to their defensive line. At approximately 1,500 hours, American observers reported movement to the north, armor moving fast, heading toward the newly captured village. Initial reports identified them as Panzer Mark IVs, which would be bad enough. Then the reports were updated. Tigers. 3 of them. The news spread through Company L like a virus. Tigers. The word carried a weight beyond its tactical meaning. These were the machines that had dominated the Eastern Front, that had destroyed entire Soviet tank brigades, that could engage Allied armor at ranges where return fire was ineffective. And Company L had no dedicated anti-tank weapons in position. Their anti-tank guns were still being moved up through the narrow roads and paths that led to Carano. The supporting armor, the Shermans that might have stood a chance in a coordinated defense, were somewhere behind them in the confusion of the rapid advance, which left the infantry alone, in a village they had taken hours ago, facing 3 Tiger tanks with nothing but small arms and a handful of bazookas. Van Barfoot was eating cold rations when he heard the news. He had not stopped moving since before dawn, had been in combat for more than 9 hours, had killed an unknown number of enemy soldiers and captured several more, had walked through minefields and assault positions and had somehow survived. He was exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness, exhausted in the deep tissue and bone, the kind of exhaustion that came from spending too many hours in a state of hyper-alertness where any moment might be your last. But when he heard about the Tigers, he put down his rations and picked up his Thompson and started looking for a bazooka. He found one with a young private who looked at the weapon as if it were a poisonous snake. The private was happy to let Barfoot take it. He was less happy when Barfoot asked if there were any more rockets. 2, Sergeant. That's all we got. Give them here. Barfoot took the bazooka and the 2 rockets and moved toward the southern edge of the village, toward the sound of approaching engines. Other soldiers were digging in, preparing hasty defensive positions, setting up machine guns in windows and behind walls. It was the sensible thing to do. Take cover, wait for the tanks, hope that concentrated small arms fire might force the crews to button up and limit their effectiveness. But Barfoot had seen what Tiger tanks did to defensive positions. They did not engage in duels. They stood off at range and methodically destroyed strong points one by one with their 88mm main guns. Guns that could punch through building walls as if they were paper. The infantry would die in their positions, killed by high explosive and collapsing buildings, and the Tigers would roll through Carano and retake the village and erase everything that had been accomplished that morning. Unless someone stopped them. The thought formed with perfect clarity, delivered without emotion or fanfare. Someone had to engage the Tigers before they reached the village. Someone had to hit them in open ground, where they were vulnerable, before they could bring their main guns to bear on fixed positions. And that someone was not going to be a frightened private with a bazooka he did not know how to use. Barfoot moved out through the southern fields, away from the village, toward the sound of engines. He could see them now, 3 massive shapes moving across the landscape with the inevitability of glaciers. They were advancing in a line abreast formation, perhaps 70 yards between each tank, a formation designed to maximize their combined firepower and prevent the kind of flanking attack that might disable a single vehicle. He needed to get closer. The bazooka's effective range was perhaps 100 yards under ideal conditions, less under actual combat conditions where fear and adrenaline turned steady hands into trembling liabilities. He needed to be close enough that he could not miss, which meant he needed to be close enough that if he missed, the tanks would kill him before he could reload. There was an irrigation ditch running perpendicular to the tank's line of advance. Barfoot moved into it, crawling on his belly through mud that smelled of stagnant water and agricultural runoff, moving as fast as he could while staying below the line of sight. The tanks were perhaps 200 yards away now, close enough that he could hear the squeal of their treads, could see the commanders standing in their open hatches scanning the terrain ahead. 150 yards. 100 yards. The lead tank was a massive presence now, dominating his field of vision, its long 88mm gun barrel sweeping slowly from side to side as the commander searched for targets. Barfoot kept moving closer, until he judged he was perhaps 75 yards from the lead vehicle. He rose to a kneeling position, bringing the bazooka up to his shoulder. The weapon felt awkward and unbalanced, nothing like the Thompson he had carried all day. He sighted on the lead tank, aiming for the drive sprocket at the front of the vehicle, the mechanical assembly that transferred power from the engine to the treads. If he could hit that, if he could damage it, the tank would be immobilized. Immobile tanks were dead tanks, targets for artillery or airstrikes or follow-up attacks with more capable weapons. If he missed, the tank would see him and kill him. His hands were steady. He was distantly surprised by this fact. He had been in combat for more than 10 hours, had not slept in more than a day, had killed and nearly been killed multiple times, and yet when it mattered, when everything depended on the single shot, his hands were rock steady. He fired. The rocket motor ignited with a flat crack and a burst of flame from the rear of the launcher. The rocket streaked across the 75 yards separating Barfoot from the Tiger in less than a second, a straight line of smoke connecting the ditch to the tank, and struck the drive sprocket with a sharp metallic clang that he heard even over the sound of engines. The effect was immediate and catastrophic. The rocket, though not powerful enough to penetrate the Tiger's main armor, was more than sufficient to destroy the relatively exposed mechanical components of the drive system. The sprocket shattered. The left tread separated from its guide wheels, whipping forward in a mechanical spasm before collapsing into useless steel ribbon. The Tiger lurched to a halt, its engine still roaring but its mobility destroyed. The commander's hatch flew open and crew members began bailing out, understanding with the instinct of experienced tankers that an immobilized tank in combat was a death trap. Barfoot dropped the bazooka and brought up his Thompson. The German tank crew was stumbling away from their vehicle, moving toward cover, but Barfoot was already firing, short, controlled bursts that dropped 2 men and sent the others diving for whatever concealment they could find. The remaining 2 Tigers had stopped, their commanders trying to locate the source of the attack. Barfoot reloaded the bazooka with his second and final rocket, knowing he had perhaps 30 seconds before the tanks identified his position and brought their main guns to bear. The second Tiger was rotating its turret, the massive barrel swinging toward the irrigation ditch. Barfoot aimed at it, knowing this shot had to count, knowing he would not get a third chance. He fired. The rocket struck the second tank on the side armor near the turret ring. A glancing hit that did not penetrate but created enough damage and confusion that the commander ordered a withdrawal. Both remaining Tigers began backing away, their commanders having concluded that advancing into what appeared to be a prepared anti-tank position was suicidal. They did not know they were retreating from a single man with an empty bazooka. They knew only that one of their tanks had been disabled and another had been hit, and prudence dictated withdrawal. Barfoot watched them go, feeling nothing in particular. No triumph, no relief, just a distant acknowledgement that he was still alive and the tanks were leaving and Carano would not be retaken today. He stood up from the ditch and began walking back toward the village. Behind him, the disabled Tiger sat silent in the field, a 40-ton monument to what one man with the right weapon at the right moment could accomplish. But his day was not finished. As he approached the village, another soldier found him and reported that a German anti-tank gun position had been spotted approximately 400 yards to the east. The crew had abandoned it during the retreat, but the gun itself was intact and represented a potential threat if the Germans returned to reoccupy it. Barfoot found the position without difficulty. The gun was a 75mm Pak-40, a formidable weapon that could destroy any American tank at normal combat ranges. He removed several blocks of TNT from the gun's own ammunition supply, placed them in the breech, lit the fuse, and moved away quickly. The explosion was sharp and final, rendering the gun useless. As he was returning from destroying the gun, he heard calls for help. 2 American soldiers lay in a field between the German and American lines, both wounded, unable to move under their own power. They had been there since the morning assault, lying in the open, waiting for someone to reach them. Barfoot moved toward them, staying low, knowing German snipers might still be active. He reached the first soldier, a young rifleman with a shattered leg, and lifted him across his shoulders in a fireman's carry. The soldier gasped in pain but did not cry out. Barfoot carried him 1,700 yards back to the American lines, moving as quickly as he could manage under the weight, expecting at any moment to feel the impact of a sniper's bullet. He delivered the first soldier to the aid station and immediately returned for the second, another rifleman with chest wounds that bubbled and frothed with each breath. Barfoot carried him the same 1,700 yards, feeling his own strength finally beginning to fail, feeling the accumulated exhaustion of 11 continuous hours of combat pressing down on him like a physical weight. When he delivered the second wounded soldier to the medical personnel, he finally allowed himself to stop. He sat down in the dirt beside the aid station, leaning back against sandbags, and closed his eyes. Around him, the battle continued in diminished form, sporadic rifle fire, the distant thump of artillery, the sounds of a front line that was still active but no longer critical. What Van Barfoot had accomplished in those 11 hours would be meticulously documented in after-action reports, verified by multiple witnesses, and eventually recognized with the Medal of Honor, America's highest decoration for battlefield valor. The citation would describe how he single-handedly neutralized 3 machine gun nests, took enemy prisoners, cleared a path through a minefield, destroyed a Tiger tank, forced the withdrawal of 2 more, demolished an enemy anti-tank gun, and rescued 2 wounded soldiers under fire. But the citation could not capture what those 11 hours actually felt like, the grinding accumulation of small decisions that added up to an impossible day. It could not convey the specific texture of fear that came from walking through a minefield in darkness, or the cold calculation required to engage a Tiger tank with a weapon designed for much lighter vehicles, or the particular exhaustion that came from carrying wounded men across 1,700 yards of contested ground. The Medal of Honor would be presented to him by Lieutenant General Alexander Patch in a ceremony later that year. Barfoot would accept it with the same flat effect he had displayed throughout the battle, neither proud nor modest, simply accepting that what he had done was being recognized. He would continue serving through the end of the war in Europe, would fight again in Korea and later in Vietnam, would rise to the rank of colonel before retiring after 28 years of service. He would live to be 86 years old, long enough to see wars fought with precision weapons and computer targeting systems, long enough to see warfare transformed into something that bore little resemblance to what he had experienced in the fields outside Carano. But he would carry those 11 hours with him for the rest of his life, not as trauma or burden, but as the central fact of his existence, the day when everything he was, everything he had learned, everything he believed about duty and capability had been tested and had not been found wanting. In 2012, 2 years after his death, a Veterans Affairs medical clinic in Cheatham County, Tennessee, would be renamed in his honor. A highway marker would be erected near his childhood home in Mississippi. These memorials would attempt to capture in words and metal what Van Barfoot represented, but they would ultimately fail because what he represented could not be reduced to monuments or ceremonies. He represented the irreducible fact that in warfare, as in life, everything ultimately comes down to individual human beings making decisions in moments of crisis. All the technology, all the planning, all the strategic brilliance in the world means nothing if individuals fail when failure means defeat. And on May 23, 1944, in fields outside a small Italian village that most people have never heard of, Van Thomas Barfoot did not fail. The German counterattack that should have retaken Carano did not succeed. The Allied advance that had been locked in stalemate at Anzio for 4 months continued. Rome, the first Axis capital to fall to Allied forces, would be liberated 11 days later. The Italian campaign would continue for another year, costly and brutal and often thankless, but the breakthrough at Anzio, the breakthrough that Van Barfoot had helped secure, represented the beginning of the end for German control of Italy. One man cannot win a war, but one man, in the right place at the right time with the right combination of skill and will and desperate courage, can change the outcome of a battle. And battles, accumulated one after another across years and continents, eventually become wars. And wars, however vast and impersonal they appear in history books, are ultimately won or lost by individual human beings making individual decisions. Van Barfoot made his decisions and they mattered, and that is all any soldier can hope to accomplish. Thanks so much for watching this incredible story of courage and tactical brilliance. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of World War II's most remarkable individual actions, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss another historical narrative. Give this video a like if Van Barfoot's story moved you, and drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Here's my question for you. Knowing what you now know about his actions that day, do you think there's any modern equivalent to what Van Barfoot accomplished? Or has warfare changed so fundamentally that this kind of individual heroism is no longer possible? Let me know in the comments.